Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to meet the author this month, especially Sarah Penner, the author of The Lost Apothecary. I'm going to go ahead and read her bio. And a lot of times I look at an author's bio on their website and I usually cut it down, but I'm actually going to read Sarah's in full because it's really interesting and really well written. So about Sarah, I was born and raised in northern Kansas, growing up in a small log cabin nestled deep in the woods, which we'll have to hear more about. This picturesque retreat where I lived until early adulthood frames most of my early memories. I began writing seriously in 2015 after attending a moving lecture given by Elizabeth Gilbert, we all love. She was on a tour for her book, Big Magic, a game-changing book for creatives. Soon after her talk, I enrolled in my first online creative writing class, and she hasn't looked back since. I'm an avid traveler, though my heart is stuck in London, go figure. Other favorite destinations include Thailand, Ireland, Germany, Belize, and Grand Cayman. She graduated from the University of Kansas with a degree in finance in early 2021. After 13 years in corporate America, she left her day job. She is now thrilled to call herself a full-time writer. When she's not at the keyboard, you'll find her in the kitchen or the yoga studio or running outdoors in the Florida heat. She married her best friend, Mark, and she's a proud resident of the Sunshine State, where she lives with their silky hair miniature Dachshund Zoe. Miniature Dachshunds are my favorite animal, so that's lovely.
Yeah, she's a lot of work, but she's fun for sure.
So thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. As I said, if you can go ahead and just let us know all the things we're missing in that story.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, first of all, Erin, for having me on, and for everybody who's tuning in tonight. I'm so excited to be here. It's funny because I don't think I've been on a call or an event where someone has actually read the bio from my website. Normally they do just a couple of sentences that my publicist has sent over, but I'm glad you did read it, because it's really in many ways my life in a nutshell. I did grow up in a 2-bedroom log cabin in the woods. I lived there literally from my parents had me at the hospital, and then I lived there from infancy until I went to college. So almost 20 years of my life were spent in this really beautiful space, and I was surrounded by nature, and I did not have any siblings at home. And so I spent a lot of time just by myself, kind of imagining different things and writing. I that's kind of when I found my love of language and reading and writing, was when I was a child. So yes. And then at the end of that bio, you mentioned that I recently, after 13 years in finance, I resigned from my day job, and I do now write full time. That's pretty recent news for me. I just made that transition in March, and I'm still in some ways kind of trying to figure out like what my day looks like. It's always been so structured in the corporate world, where I know I need to be logged in Monday through Friday, roughly 8 to 5. And now I'm finding that I work for myself, and I just need to get my writing done and my word count in. And sometimes that happens at night, sometimes that happens on the weekends. So there's definitely a lot of changes that I'm learning now, but I wouldn't change it for anything. And I'm so thrilled to have accomplished that after so many years working in corporate America.
So for those of you that don't know, and most of you will, but a writer, Sarah's a debut novelist to start with. So for a writer to write one book and it become her full-time job, like that's tremendous.
Yeah. When you say it like that, it's so easy to get caught up in the frenzy of everything. And I have to remind myself to take a step back and just be proud of myself, because there are just before this call, I unfortunately stumbled on a review that I didn't want to see, but I saw part of it and I immediately X'd out of the screen. But it's things like that, they can be discouraging, but you have to kind of sit back and think like, wow, I'm 34 years old and I have accomplished this dream that a lot of authors spend their entire careers trying to hit the New York Times or write for full time. So I'm very, very happy with how this book has been received. And really at the end of the day, I'm just so full of gratitude that readers and librarians and booksellers and book clubs have embraced it like they have. It has exceeded my wildest dreams.
And that's so interesting that you say that, because we work with a gentleman at Harlequin, and he came to us very, very early on. And I mean, the publishers knew right away that this was going to be a bestseller. And it's almost amazing that they're so receptive to that. I mean, they're in the business, so of course they are, but they knew right away that this was going to be a big deal. Were you aware at the beginning, like when you sold your book, were you aware?
So I had some very early signs that there was something special about the Lost Apothecary. And one of those earliest signs was that I'll give you just a brief story. The Lost Apothecary is actually the second manuscript I wrote. The first manuscript was never agented. It was never published. No one has seen it. It's sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk and will never see the light of day. And many writers do kind of have that first attempt, that first book that they try to write, and it falls flat, and that's fine. You just move forward. So that first manuscript was rejected by 130 agents. So that was what I was coming from. And then the Lost Apothecary, I sent it out to 12 agents, and 5 of them offered to sign me. So I immediately realized, like, wow, there's some spark about this book that is way different, and has really kind of that momentum has stayed from that point, where I have just continued to feel this magic with the book. And it sold overnight to Park Row Books. So even from the publisher perspective, like it's just it's been just this magic from day one, and I'm thrilled about it.
Well, that's commendable enough to have gone through that first that first book and have that many rejections, and still find it within yourself, and not beat yourself up so much that you don't go on to write another book like The Lost Apothecary.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think the determination and the grit to just go back to the work and not lose heart is so important.
Absolutely. So one of the questions we got, I did get some questions emailed, and we have some questions coming up in the chat window. Again, ladies, if you'd like to ask live, Eunice has her hand up. I will ask you in 1 second. I think you started it last time too. Well, I'm glad that you're a go-getter. The first question I have for you is, have you been mudlarking?
Yes, I get this question all the time. I did go mudlarking in summer of 2019. This was pre-COVID, pre-lockdown, pre-pandemic. And it was when the book was mostly written, but my agent and we were working on revisions before we sold it to Park Row Books. So I still had the opportunity to revise and edit the manuscript. And so I went mudlarking, had a phenomenal time. It's such an interesting and unique experience for anyone who travels to London in the future and is looking for something different to do while you're there. And I was able to incorporate a lot of the sensory detail that I gained through that experience into the manuscript. So the sounds, it's actually very quiet down in the river, even though you're kind of in the middle of this busy city. And Caroline observes that as well in the book. So there were a lot of sensory details I was able to include. And I did not, unfortunately, find an apothecary vial, but I found all sorts of cool pottery fragments and a piece of a clay pipe and animal bones. And there's all sorts of really neat stuff down there. And for anyone who's read the book or has the book, there's an Instagram handle for another mudlarker named Flory Evans, and that's in the acknowledgements of the book. And I follow her, and anyone who wants to see what these professional mudlarkers find every day, you should definitely check her page out, because they find the coolest stuff. Like just, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago, she found this like 500-year-old coin. So they find that they're really the neatest stuff. I'm not quite that experienced, so maybe someday.
All right. Eunice.
Yeah. How many rejections did you get for the first manuscript?
So I got 130 agent rejections.
So what kept you going to why did 130?
Yeah,
Like, I would have stopped at 100. I'd be like, okay, it's good, it's 100, but like, what got you to keep going?
I keep querying that manuscript? Oh gosh,
Yeah.
I'm so stubborn. That's why I apparently can't take no for an answer. But I mean, also in all seriousness, there are thousands of literary agents in the industry, and hundreds of them are very good. And I just, I started with my top tier agents and didn't make any progress and just kept going. But I will tell you, by the time I got to that last batch, I was there were like Hail Marys every time. Like I sort of knew that I couldn't quite take no, but I knew what it meant. So I'm so glad now that it didn't get published and didn't get agented, because The Lost Apothecary, I think, has been so much more splashy and worthy of, actually hitting the page. But yeah, it really speaks to my stubbornness, I think.
And I wonder, do you know what you could do to make that one come back to life?
That's a great question. There are some really just monumental issues with that manuscript. And what I mean by that is the characters in that story don't have as much agency. They're mostly responding to things happening to them, but they're very much victims of their circumstances. And we really don't see the redemption until the end of the story. And the industry, especially with like women's historical fiction, just really doesn't like that. And The Lost Apothecary is on the complete other side of the spectrum. Not only do the women have agency, but they're literally killing the men who have wronged them. So it's as far down the path of agency as you could go. And I think that speaks to why it was so popular with the agents and publishers that we sent it to.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, if you'd like to ask a question live, please put your hand up and we'll make it happen. So we do have a question here from Shara. And well, first let me read Jennifer's message here because it's quite nice. She said, this was one of the few books that everyone in Brooklyn enjoyed. We usually have a mixed group, but everyone liked this one.
I'm so glad to hear. It's funny. I talk to a lot of book clubs and some of them are braver than others. And it's kind of funny, the brave groups, there's always at the end, people start like telling me what they didn't love. And, I have pretty thick skin. But I'm glad to hear that this group, they all had pretty good things to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, historical fiction really does usually fall very well with our groups. So we had a meeting yesterday. It was a global meeting, and it ran the first question is always rated 1 to 5, and it got anywhere from a 3. I think somebody gave it a 3, but then mostly anywhere between 3.5 and 5. So it was great. Everybody enjoyed it.
Yeah, good to hear.
So, sorry, Shara, your question is, was the story of Nella and Eliza inspired by a true historical relationship or people?
No. Yeah, sorry. Sorry. I was just gonna add the background. I just was very inspired by the kind of like it was such a creative relationship. I'm sorry, I would be on camera, but I'm actually like on the COVID ward on call right now. So I can't do that. But I'm really interested in hearing both like whether the relationship was inspired by something, but also like just where you got the idea for Nell in general. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for your question, and thank you for your service to healthcare, which is so important. That's like wonderful that you're tuning in. So to answer your question, the relationship between Nella and Eliza is not based on a historical relationship. It's entirely my own imagination. But I will say something I've learned about myself as a writer, and the reason I say I've learned this is because I'm finding a similar relationship in my next book that I'm working on now. I really like this idea of kind of an apprentice or an understudy with an older woman who's more so an expert or a master of her field. And I don't know why. I actually just today I took a walk and I was trying to do some soul searching, like, why am I finding myself writing all of these relationships with this apprentice expert dynamic? And I don't know, like it's just authors have these themes that we tend to lean towards. And apparently that's one of mine. So I just like the balance there. Nella is very vengeful and grieving and full of pain. And then Eliza is very much her foil or her opposite. She's very like playful and inquisitive. No scars, no baggage. And in the beginning of the book, when she runs her finger down the soot-stained wall in Nella's shop, that's sort of a symbolism or metaphor for what she's ultimately going to do to Nella's heart over the course of the story. She's going to kind of remove some of that blemish and show that Nella does have good underneath all of that stain. And I like that. I just like that even though the older, quote unquote, wiser woman is teaching the younger woman, there's actually other ways to view that, because in many ways, Eliza is teaching Nella a lot about life as well, and a lot about the own goodness in her heart that maybe she doesn't see anymore. So I like that dynamic. It's not quite mother-daughter. There are obviously some parallels to mother-daughter, but I think mother-daughter is so much more complicated, and there's so many more layers there. And I think it's interesting to try and replicate some of that closeness between two very dissimilar women, unlikely friends. And so that's why I kind of went with that angle. And like I said, I'm seeing myself fall down a similar path in my next book. And I really like it. It's just fun to explore that for me.
Okay, the questions are coming in, but we have one emailed to us from Sarah, and she wants to know did Caroline find out Nella's name? Her name is at the top of Caroline's dissertation at the end of the book. Was it in a register or somewhere else in the shop for Caroline to find to credit her?
Yeah, so this is kind of getting into questions that would have happened after you turn the final page and the book has ended. So in the book that we all read, in the book that I wrote, she doesn't find Nella's name, but absolutely once she goes back someday to the shop, somewhere in those documents, I imagine Nella's name was. I didn't really think about which document specifically that would be, but that's why she's able to then put Nella's full name in the Apothecary of Poisons at the very end.
One question that came up yesterday in book club was that she's going to do her master's and she wants to do her master's about this specific topic, but the girls couldn't really accept that she had thrown the vial into the river.
Yeah, that's it's funny. This is book clubs ask this all the time. It seems people get like this visceral anger, and I have my reason that is so logical in my opinion, and I will defend it. This is like the hill I will die on. For me, okay, like she finds this vial, it changes her life. She also knows that it changed Eliza's life. She has two choices with this vial. She can bring it home, sit it on a mantle to get dusty. It'll probably end up in a box of things, if not the trash, like someday in her life. Or she can throw it back into the river, knowing that it's already changed two people's lives, and it could very well, because of fate, change someone else's life down the road. So that's such a more selfless act and a more important act, in my opinion. And so for me, there was no question that she would give it back to the river and give that gift and that gift of fate and possibility and change and opportunity to some unknown woman down the road.
Brilliant.
Roberta, I saw you nodding your head during that answer. I could tell you liked it.
I love the book. And I do have a comment that I read, or a segment of words, and that was malignant mass of grief.
Mm-hmm.
That touched me, as I've had experience of that. And I was never able to process it in a proper sense. And to see the malignant mass of grief, I had to write it down. I had to write the page down. I had, I had to put it in my list of important things,
Mm-hmm.
because that is what grief can be. And so I wanted to thank you for such succinct description of such a difficult event. And I appreciate
thank you so much, Roberta, for that comment. It's interesting hearing different passages or just even sentences or several words that impact people differently. And I'm glad that one resonated with you. I lost my dad about 6 years ago, and we were very close. And I kind of know it's another, metaphor or analogy that I like to use is it feels like a bruise. Like when you push on it, it hurts, but a lot of times you just forget it's there. And so that's similar, I think, to like this massive grief. Like most of the time it's not irritated, it's not tender, but anyone who's lost someone they love, they know that anniversaries and birthdays and holidays and Mother's and Father's Days, like that's when it aches. And so that I also was going for sort of a medical metaphor as well, just given that Nella is an apothecary. So thank you very much for those kind words.
And I do agree with you now about the throwing back of the vial, because I was astounded as well. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't do that. And now the reasoning behind it absolutely validates why you did it, and absolutely for the right reasons.
I feel like I need to like do a YouTube explanation or something, because everyone says that. They're like, oh, it makes so much sense now. And if I could, I would go back and just explain that in the book. But I think I was thinking it more so than actually typing it out on the page. And I would have to reread the scene now. I think she briefly alludes to that, but I should have probably put it in clearer terms. It's too late now. And, you know, if I do go out and share it on my socials, it's like I'm kind of giving away a spoiler. So I'm just like, whatever, people can ask me in the book clubs if they really want to know.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Roberta. We have another hand up. Lisa, please feel free.
Hi. So I actually loved that she threw, this wasn't what my question was, but I loved that she threw that that glass bottle back in. I have lots of old bottles and they're just kind of scattered around, and I always think of them as an empty place that can be filled with something. So, you know, even from the image on the front through the story, I kind of thought of that vial as holding a story or holding a place, or it was empty, but could hold. So we explored everything through the story of what was being held, and it was time for somebody else. So it just made sense to me that it would be thrown back to be filled with something else. But that wasn't my question. My question was, when I've gone to see older buildings, they are really moldy and they are in real disrepair. And it seems that when she goes and she discovers this old building, that except for all the cobwebs and dust that you kind of feel you're touching and moving as she walks through, it's intact. And that surprises me. And I wondered why you chose to describe it in that way.
So I'm curious, Lisa, have you been to London?
I have not.
So I've been there many times, and there are so many buildings there that are hundreds of years old. Of course, the ones that I have walked into are businesses or pubs or what have you. And so they're being cared for and refurbished and all of that. But there are so many. One of the reasons I love London, and Erin mentioned this in the bio, and then one of the reasons also that it just fits so well for me to put this door kind of in this subfloor area of this building is because in London, it's like this very modern city now. But if you're just walking down one of the main streets, there's so many like back alleyways and just very narrow brick cobble alleyways. And you just kind of look and there's like these little doors and these little passageways, and all of it is intact. Like it looks safe to walk through. And so that was kind of what I was drawing in my imagination when I wrote the story. I would argue, I mean, I haven't personally, I can't personally attest to this, but I would argue there are probably hundreds of doors in the city of London that have not been opened in 50 years. And if you went in, you're going to find like World War II era tools and gardening instruments and all sorts of weird stuff. And you know, who knows what if you're going to keep like breaking through a couple of walls, what you might find. So I think your point is valid, but I think it doesn't feel like a stretch for me that down one of these back alleyways behind a well-sealed door that's mostly protected against the elements, that you might find, you know, something kind of like what I described.
Because it seemed, I mean, I've been to Hungary, Austria,
Yeah.
you know, that area. So I guess maybe, I don't know. I just assumed that it would be more moldy and weathered. But anyhow, thanks for the explanation. And now I obviously have to go to London.
Well, and also at a certain point, you know, we are writing fiction, and we have to get the scene somehow. We have to get the setting in place. And so there are many places in the book where, you know, I've taken creative liberties and sped things along that might not go as quickly as they do, or, you know, put a couple of things in a convenient location to be found. That's the balance, and something that, especially as a debut novelist, there are a number of places where I took creative liberties with fiction. And I think the plausibility, the more I write and the more I like ask myself the hard questions, what's plausible and what's not, the more I can kind of improve on that. But it's definitely one of those things where anytime you pick up fiction, you know, you're going to know you'll have to suspend a little bit of disbelief.
No improvement needed. Fantastic the way it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great. So I lived in London for 7 years, and I want to know, does this street really exist? Because I was like racking my brain to try and figure out exactly where she was in London.
Which street specifically are you talking? Are you talking about Bear Street or Back Alley?
Bear Street.
Yes, it does. It absolutely does. And the map that's referenced in the book, which is John Roke's map, he pulled it together in 1746. I have like 3 copies of it. I have it in print. I have it electronically. I have it framed. It's, if you, and you can view it online as well. There's like a very lovely digitized image of it. If you type in any of the streets, it will pinpoint on the map where they are at. And you can also do the overlay, which I describe in the book, where if you want to see it with modern day locations, you can do that as well.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, Jill. So Jill's asking a question about the end, but she's saying that we're all supposed to have read the book. So hopefully it's not a spoiler. If it's anybody doesn't want to hear about the end, please shut down now. She says, since we've hopefully all read the book, can I ask a question about the ending? Should we be interpreting, to be fair, it's not going to really ruin the book if you haven't finished it. Should we be interpreting the ending to have a magical realism feel, or did I miss another more accurate explanation for Eliza's survival?
Yeah, and then I also just briefly skimmed the next question about Eliza's husband's death. So these are somewhat related. And what I mean by that is I always tell readers, if the author wants you to know what happened, they're just going to tell you what happened. So in this instance, Jill, you did not miss anything, you know, a more accurate explanation for Eliza's survival. The questions that are presented throughout the story about what's magic and what's real are purposeful, and I purposely don't answer them, because it's really, that's the fun of magical realism, is that the reader and the characters kind of ask those questions and they get to decide for themselves. That same answer goes for Tom Pepper's death. I want the reader to kind of ask, like, wait a minute, did he really die from pleurisy of the chest, or was it something else? Now, that said, another question I get all the time, I'm kind of surprised it hasn't come through yet, is will there be a sequel, or will I tell the rest of Eliza's story? And so while I'm not working on that book now, I like to think that yes, someday down the road, I will pick up Eliza's story. I would love to tell more about her and Tom Pepper's romance and the little magic shop that they open, and then also open up that mystery, that Pandora's box about his death and maybe what did or did not cause it. So I think that I kind of had a couple of goals when I left that purposely open, one of them being that I didn't want to walk through that door quite yet, knowing that someday there might be a sequel for Eliza. But magical realism is one of my favorite things, and it falls within this umbrella in the industry known as speculative fiction. And speculative fiction is anything that makes the readers and the characters ask what's real, what's illusion, what's really happening here. And there are other forms of speculative fiction as well. It doesn't have to just be magic. But I think it's so fun to play with, and a really popular subgenre. And I find, again, I'm talking about my next book that I'm working on. It has another element of speculative fiction. It's not magic. It's something else that I don't want to spoil for anybody. But I love that question, because who of us haven't, woken up from a dream, for instance, and we dreamt about just this really random person that we haven't seen in like 8 years. And then later that day, we're at the grocery store and they just happen to be in town and they live halfway across the country. Like stuff like this, I feel like happens to people all the time. Or you'll be watching TV and you see like a strange shadow that you can't explain in a corner of the room. Like all of these questions that in real life we ask ourselves, what was that? Like, is there something else at play here? Or is this just a vivid imagination? All of those things are real in life. And so I like to write about them in fiction as well.
Can we dive in? Is his name James, the husband?
Caroline's husband is James. Yes.
James, yes. Okay. Can we talk about him? Because he really, so I actually felt like he got a really sort of like the short end of the stick, because everything was told from her perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually got into quite a deep conversation last night about the fact that it's like those sliding door moments in your life where you make a choice, and it always seemed that she was making the choice that was like helpful for him and not for her, and she kept sacrificing herself. But in marriages and with families and everything, you're always making the choice that's best for the family. So I actually thought that he sort of got the short end of the stick, and when he took the eucalyptus oil, it made him seem like a psychotic. Like, what the heck? So can you just talk about him a little bit more?
Yeah, so James is interesting, and this is a little bit of inside information for everyone on this call. James was not nearly as villainous when I first wrote this book. I actually, he wasn't nearly as villainous. He actually, in my mind, was like kind of a decent guy, and they were just having marital problems. Like, who doesn't? And my agent got her hands on it, and she was like, no, we need to make him worse. So I tried to kind of do what felt true and right to me, and amplify his villainousness a bit. And then my editor got her hands on it. She's like, I want it even worse. Like, James needs to be even worse. And that's where like the eucalyptus oil and the very manipulative behavior came in. He had always cheated on Caroline. That was in my original story, and very closely replicated the types of betrayals that Nella helped her own customers with 200 years earlier. But the manipulative, and just really kind of sleaziness to him that evolved over the course of the story. And he is pretty unlikable. Like, I'm actually surprised, Erin, to hear you say that, like, you think he got the short end of the stick. I think you might be the first person who's ever shown him any sympathy whatsoever, which is admirable. I mean, to be able to walk in someone else's shoes and see what they're going through. What's interesting also is I mentioned I worked 13 years in finance, and about 4 of those years were for a public accounting firm, which is the type of company James works for. And then I have a really good guy friend who still works for the company, and he read the book and said, it's like spot on the types of drama he sees with his coworkers all the time. Like, they are unfaithful to their wives with like some girl that they're working with. And so it's just kind of funny. Like, I tried to make it as realistic as I could for him. The swallowing of the eucalyptus oil was, that was difficult to write going back to the plausibility thing. It was difficult to write in a plausible way, but I was kind of asking myself, like, what would someone who's really desperate to keep their wife do? And he is a little bit unhinged. Like you said, psychotic. I don't imagine him being psychotic, but he's unhinged. And like we all know, when we feel unhinged, like we've all been there, you think about just doing crazy things. And he does. And he's, he doesn't necessarily think through what that means, but he does it. And eucalyptus oil is, it is very poisonous. That's not like something that I just made up. Children have actually died from ingesting eucalyptus oil. And if I had children, I would not keep it in the house. but I knew that I needed to connect Caroline's research of the apothecary to James getting very ill, because I needed to implicate Caroline. And originally, my preferred idea was that she was going to have some poison that she got at the apothecary shop, and he was going to accidentally ingest that. However, 30 minutes researching poisons, what I learned is after 200 years, no toxin would still have its toxic properties. It would all be like vinegar or water or tar. So I had to find something that was more reasonable that he would ingest that could make him very sick. And eucalyptus oil was the solution. So that's what he did, and makes him especially unlikable, but also sort of provides that final, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back for Caroline to be like, this guy is crazy. I need to kind of revisit this marriage and my goals.
Well, thank you for the explanation. I definitely believe she should leave him, but I did feel bad for him. Maybe I'm the only one. Okay, so another interesting question we got by email from Sarah. She said, did Nella have tuberculosis? And I'm guessing that's based on the fact that how ill she was all the time.
Oh, yeah. So it wasn't tuberculosis. It was rheumatoid arthritis. I could not state that obviously in the book because it wasn't named or it wasn't like a known thing in 1791. But there are clues throughout the story, and anyone who either has RA or knows someone with RA knows this, obviously, like the swollen heat in the joints. Also, Nella says one day the pain is in one shoulder and then it moves the next day to the next shoulder. That's kind of a classic symptom of RA. And then in stage rheumatoid goes to your lungs. And so that's where at the end where she's coughing up blood, that's where that piece came in.
Another subject that we discussed a little bit in book club was the fact that the girls were surprised that this was the first time that anybody had come and wanted to kill another woman. And they were also surprised that she followed through with it. Was there any thought about sort of a different time or a different storyline there?
So Nella briefly addresses that during the scene. There's really just one or two sentences that touch on it, but she says something to the effect of, it's very possible that other people have given her poisons to women, but lied to her about it. And so she has no way of knowing and no way of stopping it. But this was the first one. I mean, her shop is so well known for being a supporter of women in a place where women can go and feel seen and trust the person that they're talking to. So in terms of someone actually coming in and saying, I want poison to kill another woman, this was the first time that happened. So again, might have happened against her knowledge, but the first time that someone's actually come in and had the bravery to say that. And I think it makes sense that it's Lady Clarence. She's very wealthy. She's accustomed to getting what she wants. She's probably not turned away or turned down very often. So it makes sense that she's the first person to go in with that wish and desire. And probably, well, obviously very surprising to her when Nella says absolutely not and throws her poison in the fire.
Thank you. So ladies, we're going to switch gears a little bit. If you have any questions for Sarah about what she's writing in the future or anything outside of the book. Oh, we've got questions about the book now. Okay, Tiffany, I'll ask your question. I absolutely love this book. A passage that stood out to her was on page 240. So here's the quote. It also meant preserving, the memory of these women in the register, granting them their single indelible mark on the world. History might dismiss these women, but I would not. Are there any women that have touched your life that won't end up in the history books?
I think most of the women all of the women in my life, because none of us are like famous or, like super wealthy. So pretty much all of the women, my friends and family, I don't think our names will end up in history books, but I like to think that in the acknowledgements of my book, I've got some names down there. The book is dedicated to my parents, and even though their names aren't there, they're my parents. And so in some ways, I guess it's kind of funny, I've never thought of it this way, but in some ways, maybe like my book that I'm writing is preserving the names of some of these people through the acknowledgements and the dedication.
I like that.
it kind of makes me think now, like maybe my next book, I should actually put my parents' names in there so that they can say their names went down in history. I'm really close to my parents. I mentioned my dad passed away 6 years ago. And then my mom and I are very close. So I think I'll take that into consideration, actually putting their names in there next time, instead of just referring to them as my parents.
Good question, Tiffany. Lisa has a question. She says, have you thought about telling the story of a modern day type of apothecary catering to women?
That's such a good question. I haven't thought about that. I will tell you, I'm just drawn naturally to historical settings. I think that there's something really enchanting and alluring about bygone eras, and I'll admit I tend to romanticize them. I realize that life before the Industrial Revolution was pretty miserable, and life expectancies were short, and beds were filled with bugs, and everything was dusty and it smelled, and it really does sound pretty horrible. But I think I can admit that I do kind of romanticize like those candle lit nights, like, or even Victorian London, like the gas lamps on the streets and the cobblestone roads and getting around in a horse carriage. I mean, you like go to Charleston, South Carolina, and you pay for a horse carriage ride, and it's like the most ineffective way to get around, but we pay for it because we want to have that feeling of history. And so I just love that old history. I'm also an Anglophile. I love anything about the UK. I love castles. So modern day apothecary, I haven't really gone that direction, but maybe someday. You never know. The strangest ideas tend to hit authors, so who knows what'll strike me in the future.
All right. So thank you for telling us about the book. We now are going to ask you, if we can, about what's next.
Yeah, so I've given a couple of clues or themes, and I'm sure that you hear this a lot, Erin. In the publishing industry, there's so much that it's like a long runway between when things happen and when they're announced. And so nothing's been announced, so I can't really delve into details, but I've mentioned that I love atmospheric historical eras. So I can say it's set in a different, but still very compelling historical era. I love cliffhangers and twists, and I like changing where the reader's head is at about 2/3 of the way through the book. There's obviously some big twists in The Lost Apothecary, and there will be some twists in my next book as well. I like writing about brave, rebellious women. And then lastly, I mentioned earlier magical realism and speculative fiction, and how there are different types of speculative fiction. So there's something different. It's not magic, but there's something different in my next book that still makes the reader wonder what's real and what's not. And that will be lightly sprinkled through the story as well.
And maybe you can't answer this, but is it based during any of the world wars?
No, it's not. So while World War II books fly off the shelves, I can honestly say I don't think I will ever write one. It's a difficult era for me to even read about, in the research that would need to be done to write a story set in that era. To write a good story set in that era would, I think, be really hard for me. I don't know. I hate to say that I turn a blind eye to it, but it's hard. That's heavy. Very heavy. So it's not set during, and in fact, it involves no wars, battles, politicians, any of that.
The reason I ask is because actually we do a historical fiction. We do it twice a year. And when we're always looking for a book that isn't actually based on around a world war, because there are so many based around the world war. So of course there's always a couple that we include in our vote, but we also try to include one that isn't based during that time period, but based in history. So Patty wants to ask a question live. Go ahead, Patty.
Can you hear me?
We can hear
Yes.
you.
When you write a book, what is your favorite historical period to write about?
Yeah.
The period? Do you like the Tudor period? Do you like, I don't know, the Georgians, the Roman Empire? What would be your absolute favorite time to write about?
Yeah, thanks, Patty, for the question. So The Lost Apothecary is set in Georgian London when King George III was on the throne. Of course, it's not mentioned in the book. I purposely stayed away from the monarchy, and I think that part of why I wrote the book in that era is because, to answer your question, that is my favorite era. It's so scandalous. It's pre-industrial revolution. London was full of brothels. That's when we also saw the gin craze. So fertility rates were down, people, life expectancy was down. There was police corruption everywhere, just like a very scandalous era. After the Georgian era, though, I like the Victorian era. But I will say I don't like the prim and proper parlor scenes so much as I like the street scenes, like kind of like Charles Dickens, basically, and what he describes in his books. I like that spooky eeriness more so than like the very stiff, women in corsets who are just kind of like doing needlepoint in the parlor. That's not as intriguing to me as like leaving those houses and going out and seeing like what's really happening in these little pubs throughout the city where people are breaking rules. So in case it's not obvious, I love scandal. I love rebellion. I love women breaking rules. But those are probably my two favorite eras. The last thing I'll say is I got into historical fiction as a reader first. And one of my first authors that I loved was Philippa Gregory. And she writes a lot in the Tudor era, like about the Boleyn sisters. And so I love that era as a reader, but I don't think I could ever write it just because I don't know a whole lot about that era. And I think it would take an incredible amount of research, but I love that as a reader.
Thank you.
So we're going to wrap up, but we have two more questions for you. The first one is just a fun question, and it's hard to answer if you haven't thought about it before. So if we put you on the spot, don't feel bad. We'll just, maybe we'll have some ideas in the chat window. But if it were made into a movie, who would play your main characters?
Yeah, so I do get this question all the time, and it's funny because I don't watch a lot of TV, but I obviously know a few character ideas. So I can really just speak to Nella. There's two actresses that I think would maybe be appropriate for her. The first would be Kathy Bates. I'm thinking of Misery specifically. Although she's very evil in that book, like in a subtle way, like obviously a very manipulative way. But I think she would play a decent Nella. And then someone today on Twitter, I saw this and I actually agree with it. Helena Bonham Carter, who we all know from Harry Potter. Again, she's just downright wicked in that, but she can really, like, her sort of dark hair with like a few gray streaks and like all of that heavy makeup that makes her just look very sunken and sallow. Like all of those things I could see, kind of applied to Nella as well. I don't know who for Caroline and Eliza. I'm just not into modern day TV shows. So, but those are a couple for Nella.
Thank you. Ladies, if you have any ideas for Caroline or Eliza, pop them in the chat window. And then maybe next time Sarah gets asked this, she'll have answers for those two. Our last question, as massive bookworms here, everybody loves to read. A lot of our community read 2, 3, 4 books a month. So Sarah, is there anything you're reading right now that we should look into?
Yes. So I'll say the first one, and I'm sure everyone's heard of these, but here are a few. The Rose Code by Kate Quinn. That is World War II, 3 female code breakers in Bletchley Park. Loved that. Anyone who loves learning about like ciphers and codes and then also wants some romance and scandal in there, I highly recommend that. And it's particularly interesting because one of the side characters is Prince Philip, who recently passed away. And I was reading that when he passed away. So that was strange, but highly recommend that book. Also, the Ernest Hemingway documentary on PBS like rocked my world. And after that, I had no idea he had all of these wives who were so fascinating. So I went and I started looking for historical fiction about him or his wives, and I stumbled on Paula McLean. And it's truly embarrassing that I've been writing historical fiction for several years and I just now I'm discovering her. but I read The Paris Wife. I didn't read it. I devoured it. Like I could not get the words in fast enough. Some of her passages, well, I sobbed like a baby at the end. Some of her passages, they just like spoke to my soul. And then I immediately closed that book and opened her next one, Love and Ruin, which is about Hemingway's third wife. I'm not liking this one quite as much because it's very war focused. And I mentioned that's just not where I lean towards. I like the relationship stuff more. However, I'm flying through this one as well. And then just a few minutes ago, I got a shipment for Circling the Sun, which is another one of her books. Like I'm obsessed with her right now. And she's on Instagram and I'm like, I want to message her, but I'm just a little nervous. I'll get there. But it's funny because so many people message me and they're like, I'm so nervous to be reaching out to you. I'm fangirling, whatever. And it's funny because like I definitely fangirl about other people like Paula McLean. So I highly recommend her. Something about the way that she just writes and her voice, it just speaks to me, and in a way that I can honestly say like no other author. It's just so poetic, and like her metaphors, everything, it just feels like how I think. And so it's so, I just love her work. I think I'll read all of her books now.
Well, you certainly hit the nail on the head because we read Kate Quinn's book, The Alice Network. So we have a lot of big fans of Kate Quinn in our community, but also we read The Paris Wife a very long time ago now, but we read that as well. So those are certainly authors that we will want to pick up. So thank you so much, Sarah, for your time. Thank you everybody for joining us. It was really a tremendous privilege to speak to you tonight and hear all about the ins and outs of the book. And we can't wait to see what's coming next.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has tuned in. If you want to stay in touch, I'm not hard to find on social media. Just search my name, I'll come right up. I also have a website for anyone who wants to know some of the historical resources and books that I used when researching this book. There's a comprehensive list on my website, as well as some resources for any aspiring writers that we might have in the group. So definitely don't be shy and feel free to say hello.
Awesome. That's a great resource. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.